Hey everybody, Joel and Brandon here from A Single Tree Podcast. We're here to talk about reconciling paradox. We all encounter paradox in our lives when we encounter two apparent opposites. An example would be the world is meaningful yet also meaningless. Obviously, those two ideas are difficult to reconcile, and so they can present tension, confusion, frustration, stress for us. And the reason that happens is because we tend to use dualistic, either or, and black or white thinking to try to analyze the world around us. And when we think of things as either or, either the world is meaningful or meaningless, it's impossible for us to reconcile those when we can only accept either or.
One of the main elements of this is to recognize that paradox is working in all of us all of the time, and that's a very natural part of the human experience. We're not taught that's happening on a deep level inside, but it's a natural part of human experiences to help us make sense and to make meaning of our experiences. So one of the most important things that we can do is just consciously accept and start opening up space inside of our consciousness for the fact that paradoxes are playing out. And one of the telltale signs of paradox is tension, which Joel will talk a little bit about.
So one of the paradoxes that we often run into in our lives is the paradox that occurs around gender. We tend to think of gender in either or terms. So you can see here on the board, there's characteristics that are typically female: sensitive, emotional, vulnerable. We tend to think of males as the opposite of those: insensitive, unemotional, and strong. An apparent paradox arises if you are a male but you are also sensitive, because we tend to think of these in dualistic categories. That doesn't make sense to us, and so it presents tension and can present frustration for us as well. The goal here is for us to accept that human beings are both sensitive and insensitive at times. The goal is also to realize that both of these on either side of the divide are useful. So there are times when it's good to be vulnerable in a relationship, for instance. There's also times when it's good to be strong. All right, so we're looking to no longer divide these into male or female, but realize these are both parts of the human experience.
Right, and one important aspect is to remind ourselves that one of the basic functions of the brain or the mind is to separate things by making sense. And inherently, there is nothing wrong with that it's a good, essential part of survival and just being a human. The problem can come when we're encountering these paradoxes and there's nothing but a process of division or separation happening. We have to find a way to go beyond that in a way that will take us further down the path of finding some sort of reconciliation of these paradoxes. And one of these parts are taking these lines away and starting to take some of the labels off of the content or the words that are arising out of the specific paradox that we're dealing with.
Another apparent paradox that we encountered is good and bad. All of us do good things and also do bad things. We encounter good and bad within ourselves even. And when we do something bad, if we're using dualistic thinking, we tend to think, I am bad because I've done something wrong. It's the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is feeling bad about something that you did wrong. Shame is feeling like a bad person yourself. Again, the goal is to be able to love and accept both the good and bad about yourself. We do this in relationships all the time. None of us is perfect. And so we accept both the good and the bad about other people. We can call that forgiveness or grace. It's also good to realize that there's a function for both good and bad behavior, as we said with the male-female paradox. It's easy to see the function of good behavior, but I think we can also make a case that there's a function for bad behavior. The function of bad behavior would be to maybe draw attention to something inside us, and I think that we all have a deep desire to be able to reconcile this apparent paradox within ourselves and even in the world around us, that there is a possibility that there can be acceptance of both the good and the bad.
Right. So one way that Joel talked about doing that was to notice the tension, realize the specific paradox that's presenting itself inside of our consciousness, whatever is arising, to be clear of it consciously, and to try to work and move into loving acceptance of this. So that's one way, that's one of the steps that we can move into that helps us out of this dualism and to find a little bit more reconciliation about the specific paradox that we're dealing with. One other aspect that we can talk about also is working to go kind of beyond the thinking process of understanding the specific paradox and working to consciously hold the space of the tension of the paradox. And what I mean by that is just consciously allowing yourself to interface and hold the tension and the tension only. In the beginning part of these processes, we've used our mind to conceptualize the content part of the paradox, which is an important aspect. But we're talking about going a little bit further down the path here, and what helps us do that is to just day in and day out consciously hold the tension that the paradox is presenting us. What that does is that it helps us drop out of our thinking mind and into a deeper kind of intelligence that's accessible. And if we're consciously holding that day in and day out without using the process of dualism, what happens and what can happen is that there can be insights that pop up along the way that can be really helpful in us assigning some new meaning and also accomplishing some level of reconciliation along the way. What we're talking about now is going further down the path, which does not have a lot to do at all with dualism, but holding the tension and just trusting the process, almost letting the paradox work on you and trusting that these insights and realizations and this reconciliation will come on their own.
Reconciling paradox, being able to hold the tension of two apparent opposites to create maybe new meaning and new growth. A Single Tree Podcast. I'm Joel. This is Brandon. You can find us on Facebook, on SoundCloud, and on iTunes.